Okay. Well, thanks for being here. Thanks for inviting me. I'd like to say a few things about Rosa Luxemburg, if that's okay, because this is the memorial lecture, and I'm not, an expert on Rosa Luxemburg, but since I'm a Marxist and a communist, and since she is, part of our greater fraternity, and today is the day she was killed. Actually, she was not the only one killed, and I'll come back to her, but I just want to say it was Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, both killed, and they were both 47 years old. I think that's important to recall. Many of these people died extremely young, or they were killed extremely young. Frantz Fanon was only 36 years old when he died. You have these enormous ideas about Luxemburg and Fanon, but they weren't allowed to live very long. Liebknecht, before I get to Luxemburg, Liebknecht was the founder of the Social Democratic Party in its new form, and he was the only person in the Bundestag, in the German parliament, to vote against World War I. He was the only parliamentarian to vote against World War I. It's quite impressive. And he moved, of course, rapidly from his social democratic politics to the politics of what would become, in a sense, communism after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. He's lesser known outside Germany, but he's a very important figure because it took some guts to be the only person in the parliament to vote not to give money for the war, World War I. Rosa Luxemburg was a very interesting, fascinating person, and I highly recommend you read so much of what she has written. The range is enormous. She was a social democratic politician who also moved rapidly leftward. In the early 20th century, she got involved in a very important debate with Bernstein. And Bernstein, Carl Bernstein and others, took the position of the evolutionary road to socialism, where they believed that capitalist structures would inevitably make themselves more efficient, and eventually there'd be not a withering away of the state, as Lenin said, but a withering away of the bourgeoisie. And you'd inevitably, in an evolutionary way, go to socialism. And Rosa Luxemburg wrote a terrific rejoinder to Bernstein called Reform or Revolution, where she laid out and charted a strategic and tactical way forward for German social democracy, arguing that you use parliaments, you use parliamentary instruments, but you have to build working class power outside parliament, because at some point there will be an armed clash where the bourgeoisie is not going to relinquish power, there's no evolutionary move, and you're going to have to be ready with the full confidence of the working class to seize power. And of course, her life proved that her point was correct, because she was killed when she and Liebknecht and the Spartacus Bund, the Spartacus League, which they started, faced a crackdown, not from the German conservatives, that's the important thing, but from the Social Democrats. The government of Friedrich Ebert, he is the one who sent the Free Corps against Luxemburg, and she was beaten. When they were arresting her, by the way, she thought she was going to prison, so she filled her suitcase with books. She was reading Goethe's Faust, and very literate person. In fact, it's an incredible book to read, The Accumulation of Capital, because she's trying to develop Marxist ideas, taking into cognizance colonialism and so on. I don't have time to get into all this, but the main thing is it's a very learned book because it's filled, like Marx's Capital, with literary references. So she puts Goethe's Faust into a suitcase, they go out, and then the Free Corps attack them. And she's bludgeoned and thrown, her body is thrown, and Liebknecht's body into the Landwehr Canal in Berlin. 100 years ago today. In Germany today there was a massive demonstration, and yesterday I think, a massive demonstration to remember Luxemburg and Liebknecht. Recently, a member of the Social Democratic Party in Germany acknowledged the role of their party in the murder of Rosa Luxemburg, really the fruit of the German revolutionary tradition. So I'm very happy that you're holding this, and I really hope that the first memorial has a second memorial, has a third memorial, and at some point it might be a good idea for people to maybe create a group and read Luxemburg's writings systematically. What I would suggest is to read the Junius pamphlet, which is about her critique of World War I, the brutality of the war. You know, she has a line which I particularly like where she said, "Workers of the world unite, that's true, but in times of war they lynch each other." And you know, that's a very pithy summation of the brutality of imperialism and war. And so I recommend you look at the Junius pamphlet, you look at the accumulation of capital, and you must read Reform and Revolution, because that's a very pertinent text for our day. You know, when people are getting interested in Marxist and socialist ideas. But, you know, you have to have a full understanding that the bourgeoisie is not, its liberalism is limited to its own gates. It won't allow property relations to be transformed. So it's a very limited form of liberalism. And I think she is a good place to start. Okay, that's all I want to say about Rota Rosa, Red Rosa. I thought I'd like to talk to you a little bit about my experience reporting from mainly West Asia but also North Africa since 1996. I thought that might be something of interest given the fact that that region has been destroyed and given the fact that from our vocabulary terms like imperialism have disappeared. You know, we don't really use these concepts much. So I want to tell you some stories and then maybe we'll come in the end to a discussion of imperialism today. Okay? So some stories. I'm going to divide my presentation into 4 countries, but they're really 4 opportunities to say 4 different kinds of things. The first is Palestine. You know, it's interesting when you think about West Asia and North Africa. I mean, people who have a sort of bigoted relationship to that region splash the word Islam from the Mediterranean Sea perhaps out to the borders of India or something, you know. They just write Islam as if it's one block, you know, an undifferentiated large block. Maybe if you're a little more sophisticated, you'll say Sunni countries and Shia countries, you know. Again, big blocks, Iran, Shia, you know, Iraq, well, who's to say? Saudi Arabia. But it's clear there, Sunni. Please come and sit down, because there's seats here. So, you know, there's this kind of crude way in which people understand the region. The fact is, if you travel from, say, Beirut out into Damascus, to Baghdad, into Tehran, and if you leave the main avenues and go into not just the countryside, but the hills, you find that just as in India, it's actually heterodox forms of social life that dominate people's world. It's not these big orthodoxies, you know, Wikipedia orthodoxies, Islam. You know, Islam doesn't exist like that as Islam. Just in the same way as if you, I suppose, decide to bicycle from here to Kanpur. Because if you drive, you don't experience this. And you stop for tea at, you know, 50 places and meet a lot of people, you find that people have very interesting ways of practicing what appears to be Hinduism. I remember finding this in my doctoral work in Punjab. I was working on the Balmiki community and I found such interesting ways in which people practice religion, you know. I mean, for instance, I don't know if you know, but in Kerala there's a temple to Duryodhana. It's a striking thought that there's a temple for Duryodhana. I mean, it's interesting. People have interesting ways of practicing, much the same in West Asia. After the emergence of ISIS, people heard about the Yazidi community, for instance. You know, Nadia Murad just won the Nobel Prize for fighting against sexual violence in war. Very brave young woman, much deserved Nobel Prize, unlike, say, Obama and people like that. Much deserved Nobel Prize. So the Yazidis suddenly come on the map, but you know, there are thousands of different Yazidi-type communities. Even in Iran, which is so stereotyped, there's, you know, this sort of high Shiism, you know, this or that. But in fact, the peasantry in Iran, they have their own different understandings, and some of this has to do with geography. So in Iraq, for instance, because northern Iraq is so hilly, people don't, in the old days, they had less communication between valleys. And even the Arabic was not identical across the valleys. So the first thing I just want to put on the table is, if one travels through these regions, and I know that the title is conflict, reporting in conflict zones, but these are not conflict zones. These are places where delightful people have been struggling to make good lives under very difficult circumstances. And they have rich and really productive cultures which are getting suffocated in our time. And I'll come back to this suffocation. Palestine is a good place to understand the complexity. I mean, driving in Palestine, you'd imagine Palestine would be the size of a neighborhood in Delhi. Maybe South Delhi. But Palestine is a tiny place. The first time I went to this road, which is known as Gandhi Road, which runs parallel to the Jordan River, and it's in fact not named after Mahatma Gandhi, but it's named after a right-wing Zionist zealot minister who was assassinated by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and he used to ironically be called Gandhi because he was the very opposite of Gandhi. So that road that runs right through the West Bank, it's an insult to the Palestinian people that this is named after this hideous character, is parallel to the Jordan River. I thought, having some passing familiarity with biblical stories and so on, not great familiarity, I thought the Jordan River would be a river, and that this region would be, beautiful with trees, and it's where Abraham, whatever, John the Baptist emerges, and it's a little stream, barely exists. You can almost hop across it at times because of a dam up top, but it's actually even small when the water is released. The Dead Sea is tiny. The Jordan River itself, the Jordan River Valley itself, is not particularly attractive. It's a harsh landscape. And the Israeli settlers have taken all the water. They control the highlands. And at every water point where water is available, the Israeli military has created a kind of barricade around it. So the Palestinians have basically no access to water unless it's through the Israelis. It's a very harsh landscape, and you wonder, why are you guys fighting over this? But of course, land is complicated, and desire for history, land, the stories of God and so on are very powerful motivators. So we shouldn't just dismiss it. But why I wanted to start here in Palestine is because Palestine was never about Muslims or Palestine. One of the oldest communities in Palestine, historically recorded communities, are also Jews. Jews have lived in Palestine for as long as recorded history. And there was never really any problem inside this region that we now call Palestine or Israel or whatever. There was never really any history of anti-Semitism. It was a complicated social ecology, cultural ecology, just as Iraq is a very complicated social and cultural ecology. People were not reduced to, Jew, Muslim, Christian, etc. They lived in very complicated and sometimes fraught ways. In a sense, the problem of Palestine is a European problem. It's not a West Asian problem. I mean, it was the Europeans who for several centuries had what is known as the Jewish question, as their problem. The Judenfrage. It's there. It was a German problem, a Polish problem, a Russian problem. It was their problem. They didn't want Jews in their towns. And those are largely people that we now consider Ashkenazi Jews, European Jews and so on. It was Europe's problem, not the problem of West Asia. After all, the Holocaust takes place in Europe. And by the way, the Holocaust is only the worst of the lot. I mean, there were pogroms right through the 19th century against Jews in Europe. So we've got to understand this as a European problem, which was then exported to West Asia. Why did Balfour, for instance, declare in 1916 that Palestine is for the Jews when Palestine was actually a multi-ethnic territory which had just come out of the Ottoman Empire? its multi-ethnic character was denied not by the people of Palestine, but by the British colonial government, which unilaterally said, this is the land of the Jews. Now, wait a minute, fellas, you didn't ask anybody. And then eventually after 1945, when the enormous gravity of the Holocaust, seized the imagination of the world, Jews were shipped from Europe to Palestine. Why wasn't it a question for Germany to come to terms with the crime of the Holocaust? There was no coming to terms for Germany with the crimes of the Holocaust. Germany exported Jews. What I'm trying to say is, in Palestine, there is what is known as the Nakba. That is the great catastrophe, the removal of thousands of Palestinians possibly from their homes to create Israel. It's called a Nakba. But there was also a Nakba in Germany. They ethnically cleansed Jews out of Europe into Palestine. We don't think of that enough. When you travel in Palestine, remnants of this old culture exist. Now the best place to experience it, of course, is not in Tel Aviv, which is a European city. It's interesting, when I was a teenager, occasionally we'd read in the papers about Eurovision, when it first started, the music contest and so on. And one of the Eurovision contestants is Israel. Israel participates in these European contests. And people say, well, it's not European, it's Asian or whatever. But in fact, parts of coastal Israel fashion themselves as European cities. Tel Aviv is the best example. But the older cities of Palestine give you a flavor of this multi-ethnic character of West Asia. So when you look at something like Jerusalem or Aleppo, a city with a very complicated cultural world, not reducible to this or that or the other. These are not regions of the world that are easily made into monocultural nations. These are very complicated cultural worlds, which would have needed their own historical development to create their own state form, their own understanding of multinational coexistence. In a sense, this is a story similar to India. If India could have produced its own form of, state, which somehow came out of its complexity rather than this history that has led us to suffocating Hindutva. Very suffocating kind of direction. The arrow is very suffocating. But the actual cultural world is much more complicated than this arrow indicates. So much the same in Palestine. Now, the problem in Palestine, and this was now at the time of the knife attacks against checkpoints, when young Palestinian children were running at checkpoints with kitchen knives often, nothing more dangerous than kitchen knives, and they were getting shot by the Israeli military. At that time, I visited a Palestinian camp near Ramallah, where the population is overwhelmingly young. The demography is very skewed. There's a lot of young people there. And I sat in a room with about 50 young Palestinian, people aged 15 to maybe 20, maximum, around 20. Very political, very sharp in their analysis of the occupation. They don't need to be told about the occupation and its reality. They experience it every day. Palestinians have no mobility at all. They are confined to, not the West Bank, they are confined to certain areas inside the West Bank. Their mobility inside there is totally curtailed. Israeli troops can drive into the areas and question them at any time. There's no sovereignty at all. So I was talking to these young Palestinians and asking them why they were rushing at checkpoints with knives. What a ridiculous thing to do. It's basically suicidal. And what is the strategy that suggests to you, even if you knife a soldier, that this was going to advance your cause? What is this about? Of course, this is a stupid question to ask them, but I felt it was necessary to start the conversation. It's a stupid question because their backs are against the wall. They feel there's no exit from their reality. Then the question is, why is there no exit from their reality? Spend a lot of time in Israel, talk to a lot of Israeli, peace activists, intellectuals of various kinds and so on, just to learn the perspective. You know, there are 3 or 4 solutions to the problem in Palestine. And in fact, the problem in Palestine, as I said, it's a good place to begin because you get a sense of the social and cultural complexity of its history, which is now being reduced. So there are 2 or 3 things on the table, solutions. And I just want to introduce them very, briefly, not at length. The first solution is the oldest solution since 1967, since the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, and to some extent the Golan Heights, although that took time till 1973. The Israeli occupation of these 3 to 4 places created a solution actually for the Israel-Palestine so-called conflict. It's not a conflict, it's an Israeli occupation of Palestine. The solution is the so-called 2-state solution, where the Israelis will have a state and the Palestinians will have a state. For many years, this was the solution of the so-called international community. By the way, I'm going to say so-called a lot. And the reason I am going to say so-called a lot is because our terms are limited. When we say international community, what we essentially mean is the United States government, which is essentially the force that blocks any way forward because it is a ventriloquist dummy for the Israeli right. So the so-called international community, for the last 20 years or so, 30 years, has had this as the main solution to the conflict or the occupation of Palestine, the 2-state solution. The idea being that the Palestinians will get Gaza, the West Bank, and perhaps East Jerusalem, and that's Palestine, and the rest is Israel. Now, the problem is that from 1977, when Ariel Sharon became the Minister of Agriculture, wow, a so-called war hero, Ariel Sharon, took the Ministry of Agriculture post. Why did he take the Ministry of Agriculture post? Why wasn't he the Minister of Defense? Because in 1977, that was the key post, not to conduct land reforms, not to register tenants, not to abolish landlordism, none of that. It was to find a strategy to seize the West Bank. And it was through the Department of Agriculture led by Ariel Sharon that the settlement policy begins in the West Bank. So from around 1977 to 1994, when the Israelis and Palestinians go and sign the Oslo Accords, which set up the so-called 2-state solution, between 77 and 94, the Israeli settlers have essentially come in and created their own world inside the West Bank, in Gaza, and basically taken over East Jerusalem. In other words, and this is a term that the Israeli right wing uses a lot, the facts on the ground show, the facts on the ground, this is their favorite term, facts on the ground show that a Palestine is not possible because the West Bank, Gaza, etc. is ours. Now, today, to speak of a 2-state solution is entirely illusionary. It is not possible. There is no possibility of a territorial 2-state solution. The West Bank has been entirely absorbed into Israel. East Jerusalem does not exist as a separate entity anymore. In fact, this was the whole controversy about the United States moving its embassy to Jerusalem. There is a big university built by the Israelis in East Jerusalem. That's gone. Gaza, if you followed any of the wars, is a small sliver of land with no independent access to the sea or any other country, and is being slowly suffocated. So the 2-state solution is a total illusion. The 3-state solution is the preferred Israeli right-wing solution. And the 3-state solution is essentially Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. In other words, put bulldozers at the mark of the 1967 line and bulldoze the Palestinians across the border into Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. That's the 3-state solution. That's what they would prefer to do. The final ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. The 1-state solution, is that okay if you got the 3-state solution? That's the most vicious solution. I mean, that's terrifying. But that's really on the table. They don't talk about it like that, but I'm trying to popularize the term three-state solution, because I think this is actually what they're going for, the annihilation of Palestinians. You know, in Israel, if you talk to somebody and say Palestinians, they say, oh, you mean Israeli Arabs. It's a little bit how you can go into a shop and you can get Israeli hummus and Israeli falafel and Israeli tabbouleh. What they're doing is they're taking all the cuisine of the region, which I will admit is a multi-ethnic history to it. I'm not going to turn around and say, you know, it's not Jewish. Some of these things are also, but it's definitely not Israeli. You know, maybe we can call it Levantine, or we can call it Jerusalem tabbouleh. One interesting thing, this region is so small, they all fight about who makes the best tabbouleh. You know, Hebron or this or that. It's a little bit like in Bengal, you know, West. In Calcutta itself, there's debate. In Howrah area, it's better than in, you know, here and so on. So these are petty ecologies. So why not name it, you know, Halabi, you know, from Aleppo, Homos? No, it's Israeli, because it's a policy of the cultural extermination of a people. Golda Meir, the former Prime Minister of Israel, used to say, there are no Palestinians, there are only Arabs. It's just complete erasure of the Palestinians. That's a three-state solution. The one-state solution, a democratic approach, is totally unacceptable to the Israeli right wing and to large sections of the rest of the Israeli population. What this is a democratic state with a multi-ethnic, multinational character, where everybody has the same rights. The problem for Israel, just as the problem for Saudi Arabia, and in some sense the problem for the Hindu right, is that what they want is a Jewish state. They want a state where Jews are more privileged citizens than others. But if you have a Jewish state, then what do you do with the Christians, the Muslims, the Palestinians, this, the that, the Armenians, all the non-Jews? Well, they become second-class citizens. If you have an ethno-nationalist state project called the Jewish state, that means that any Jew around the world can show up at Tel Aviv airport and get a passport. But any Palestinian descendant cannot even enter the country. That is what we call, this is a technical term, apartheid. So a Jewish state policy is an apartheid policy. But you can't have a one-state solution, therefore, which is a Jewish state, one-state solution. You have to have a multi-ethnic, multinational character of state. If you do that, then Israel no longer can be a Jewish state, but a state of the people who live in Israel. By the way, that's how most modern democracies function, except, you know, places like, say, Saudi Arabia. Israel hates to be compared with Saudi Arabia, but really it's a good comparison, because in that region, these are some of the few states which privilege certain people over others in terms of their rights and obligations and so on. And the others, you know, Palestine is very hard to own land and so on. So the one-state solution is a problem for the Israeli, you know, polity. This is not a Palestinian problem, because most Palestinians today are quite happy to be in a one-state, because effectively the Israeli capture of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and to a great extent Gaza has created a one-state, but it's created a one apartheid state. So now to move from one apartheid state to one democratic state is a problem of the Israelis, not the Palestinians. And yet, because of the domination of the United States in that region, the mass media will tell you that Palestinians don't want to negotiate. Well, what are the Palestinians supposed to negotiate? That is why those young people in the camps in Ramallah have their backs against the wall and stand with kitchen knives running at checkpoints. The reason they do that is that there is no path ahead for them. They feel forgotten. Nobody cares about them. Punctually, Israel smashes Gaza. Nobody seems to care. Universities are bombed. I mean, you know, I don't know about you, but I would imagine as college students, university students, every time Islamic University in Gaza is bombed, I'd imagine JNU should be shut down. You should stand in solidarity with those students. You know, Israel says sometimes it's a school of terrorists. Well, actually, it's a school that has a faculty of medicine. and it has a faculty of law, and it has a faculty of social science. It looks a lot like JNU. It looks uncannily like JNU. It's not as big. Yes, sure, there's more symbols of, Islam on the campus because it is increasingly getting more and more religious, which Gaza was not. The last point on Palestine before I move on. The leaders of Hamas have said repeatedly privately that they are called by the Israelis the terrorists, but they are afraid in Gaza that they are beginning to be marginalized and much more radical groups are emerging. Much more radical groups are emerging because they see Hamas as people who are willing to negotiate at an empty table. And they say, why are you negotiating at an empty table? We have to raise the price of suffering inside Israel. Palestine, point one. Okay? Let's move on to Syria. I hope you see there's a story here. In the middle of the Syrian crisis in 2012, the war in Syria, I was with a person, we were in the Kalamun Mountains, which is on the western flank of Syria, runs essentially along the Lebanese-Syrian border. And we were traveling and we encountered a group of Al-Qaeda fighters and stayed with them for a little bit. Now what was interesting about these Al-Qaeda fighters is that none of them were from Syria. That's the first interesting thing. Most of them were from North Africa. They were Libyans and Algerians. I was very interested in them because the sheikh of this unit liked Hindi films a lot. He was a total aficionado. And so are others on their laptops. They all carry laptops. They have Kalashnikovs and so on, but they all carry laptops. In their laptops, many of them have downloaded Hindi films. They don't watch Egyptian serials. So these guys who are supposedly pious, etc., are all watching, Shah Rukh Khan and others dancing around, and God knows what all they watch. But I was very interested because the sheikh said to me, he called me and said, what's your favorite Hindi film star? Now, this was a very tense moment for me because I thought, I can't screw this up. See, what if I say the wrong name and he gets angry? Because there's no court of law here. There's no arbitration. This is where the monopoly of force is vested in one person. And I wasn't armed. They were fascinated. What is an Indian reporter doing in this area? They were fascinated by that. They'd never seen it. I asked him, I said, he said to me, are you scared of anything? I said, I'm scared you'll kidnap me. He said, what's the point of kidnapping an Indian reporter? That's what he said to me. I said, that's terrible. I should report that to Narendra Modi. I thought under Modi, India's standing has gone up and so on, that's rather disappointing, But he says to me, what's it? I was petrified, probably sweating, looked like I was going to faint. And then he said, do you want me to tell you my favorite star? Of course, he then proceeded to tell me all his favorite films and so on. When I wrote this story for the Hindu, I decided not to name the star. Because that would have been chaos in India. Imagine, Al-Qaeda Emir likes this movie star. Imagine the communal riots that might have started and so on. Don't you think? So we decided better not name that person. That would have been very unfair. So that was the name. What was interesting was they came, and by the way, the Algerians have a favorite Hindi film, which is fascinating, from the 60s. They all know the song, and I was confused, it's not a mediocre film. And they all Jane tu, that sort of thing. I was like, I don't know this song, but this is amazing. With a heavy Algerian accent. Why are they coming to Syria? What is happening in this region of plurality and complication? Why did these wars erupt? Well, the funny thing about these parts of the world is that there are basically two kinds of governments that developed after World War II. One was the monarchies, the Saudis, the various Emirates, the Moroccan king, all allied together. I guess the Americans think they're democratic countries or something because they seem to have a 1,000-year fealty to the Saudi monarchy. You know, Mike Pompeo just went to meet, you know, Mohammed bin Salman, taking probably notes from him how to dissolve human beings in acid and so on. God knows, they were exchanging notes on torture. I don't know what they're doing. They keep talking about Saudi Arabia as a force of stability in the region. It's an extraordinary idea, you know, for anybody who's traveled from Afghanistan to Morocco, it's the opposite of stability. But anyway, let's let the Americans have their view. You know, they're entitled to their own opinions. You know, 100 flowers bloom and contend and so on. Idiotic ideas, but it's their idea. So, there were these monarchies and so on one flank. On the other flank were the Republican governments that emerged out of the kind of Arab nationalist and Arab socialist tradition. Abdul Gamal Nasser and the free officers in Egypt in 1952, that was the first blast, and then I guess the last was Gaddafi in 1969. And then the Assads and so on in between. Now these governments, unlike the monarchies, claimed to have a certain, and they did have a pact with the population. The pact was quite simple. We'll take care of the politics. And you know, this one-party state, post-colonial states, one party, one ruler, is very common. Actually, it's not uncommon. It's not like Assad was the only one-party state. In fact, Julius Nyerere, a very sensitive socialist in Tanzania, had a theory of the one-party state, you know, where his party would be the only one because they didn't want imperialism to come in, you know, said you have democracy. I don't agree with them, but they have a theory. And many countries across the world, post-colonial states, opted for this one-party thing. Sometimes it was a military dictatorship, whether it's in Pakistan, you know, with Ayub and so on, or it's through what looks like some sort of democratic thing, like in Egypt, where they had elections and, you know, Mubarak won 98% and so on. But they said, leave the politics to us, but we'll take care of you. In other words, we'll provide jobs, we'll provide food, we'll provide some entertainment, you know, basic things. A little bit like, although we had elections, and you know, Ram Bua loves saying that how India has elections, and he wrote a giant book, India After Gandhi, whose thesis is, look, we have elections. You know, every so many years we have elections, and we did not have elections. That was the point of the book. Fair enough, but still, India also was kind of a one-party state for a long time. The Congress said, leave it to us, badly behaved, emergency, but we'll give you, you know, roti, kapra, makan, whatever, garib Delhi se hatao, we'll grow some trees, you know, all these slogans were theirs. It's the same sort of thing, not identical. So these were the two basic parts. When the whole Soviet Union collapsed, Third World Project died, debt crisis, this, that and the other, these same states began to liberalize. And that's really when the crisis begins. Egypt was the one ahead of everybody else. They began to liberalize in the 1970s under Anwar Sadat. The moment they began to liberalize, they said to the population now, I mean, they didn't really say that, they said this is what their policy appears like, although it would be nice to see Anwar Sadat making the speech, saying to the people, okay, continue to give me political monopoly, don't need elections, we'll have some elections, some friendly parties can run, they can get 1%, 0.5%, I'll get 98%, but, you know, we'll deliver for you food and so on, except now we won't. Because we're liberalizing the economy and we're not going to be able to provide bread for you at a cut price, we're not going to be able to, and we're going to use our mafia connections to build up real estate and so on. So in all these countries you saw this social pact between the post-colonial Arab socialist government and the population frayed. From Algeria out to the borders of Iran. Iran is a separate thing, I'll come back to that. This whole region, you know, and this is why in the 1990s there was a major civil war in Algeria. It was a war between the Islamist political forces and the old, you know, nationalist, socialist government of Algeria. That was actually the beginning of the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was not about we want to be American. The Arab Spring was we want to come in and renegotiate this social pact because it has destroyed our lives. We have been, in a sense, hoodwinked. People didn't say we want elections, they said we want bread. I mean, the main call in Tahrir Square, the first slogans were all about bread, because bread prices had gone up. there was a problem in the Russian wheat market and so on, and bread prices went up. That was the spur. Indignity, that is call for dignity, and bread. These were the two things. They weren't saying, give us American-style elections, where parties can raise, or Indian-style. Parties raise huge amounts of money, and anyway our voices are suffocated. As if in India, the voices of the majority are heard. They are suffocated anyway. It's a huge expense, distorted form of politics and so on. So in Syria, this has been an issue since the 1990s. Now, I'm going to pause and bring Iran into the story, and then we'll come back to Syria. After the Iranian Revolution, it was really an Iranian revolution. All sectors, communists to Khomeinyites, participated. After the Iranian Revolution, it was clear that Iran was going to be a republic. The monarchy had been annulled as a social political force. No way. No monarchy. No new king. So when Khomeini returns from Paris and, basically the Islamists take the revolution in their hands, others were falling away from it, they had to create an Islamic republic. Obviously, Islamic republic is not an unfamiliar concept in Asia, the rest of Asia. Now, of course, Iran is in Asia, but the rest of Asia. In some ways, Pakistan was an Islamic republic. It was a republic. Bangladesh after 71 was an Islamic republic, especially after 72, after Mujibur Rahman was killed. It's an Islamic republic. But Iran was an Islamic republic in a very special place. See, everybody exaggerates the Shia-Sunni divide. But if you go back before 79, the Shah of Iran was great pals with the Saudi kings. Before 79, there was no Shia-Sunni problem at the elite level. They were in fact allies with the Americans against the Nasserites. And later they were allies with the Americans, not later, but through that, against the Soviets. There was no Shia-Sunni tension until 1979-80. In 1979, what the Iranians said against Saudi ideology was the Iranians said, you can be an Islamic society, you can have an Islamic state, you don't need a king. They were a Republican Islamist force, and they directly threatened the Saudi monarchy. Khomeini and others directly threatened the Saudi monarchy. And you may not know this, or you may know it, but there was an uprising in Saudi Arabia, in fact in Mecca. And there was a seizure of the big mosque, Haram al-Sharif in Mecca. There was also an uprising in Islamabad, where the American embassy was seized, a little known story. So suddenly the Iranian revolution started to spread, and this terrified the Saudis. Saudis then pay Saddam Hussein to invade Iran in 1980. The Saudis, the Kuwaitis, UAE, others, they told Saddam, we're going to pay you to fight against Iran. That war went on for 8 years. Now, why I bring up Iran to pause from the Syria story is that over the course of this Iran-Iraq war, and then after the collapse of Saddam's agenda, Saddam goes in 2003, but Saddam's agenda essentially dies in 1991. His own experiment, because the Americans hem him in after the war of 1991, the first Gulf War. Iran develops very close ties with the Syrian government. And the reason Iran develops very close ties with the Syrian government is Syria was Iran's conduit. It would have been good if I had brought a map, right? I'm sorry I didn't bring a map, but try to imagine this. Syria was Iran's conduit to Lebanon. And in Lebanon, southern Lebanon in particular, is a majority Shia area, but that's not the main thing. The main thing was southern Lebanon has a very historical link with Iran. For instance, the elites of the hills of southern Lebanon often marry Iranian elites over the course of hundreds of years. Important Lebanese sheikhs are venerated in Iran. So this tie between Iran and southern Lebanon goes back a very long time. When the Israelis invaded Lebanon in 1982, a new political force develops in southern Lebanon, and that force's name eventually is Hezbollah, the army of God. Now Hezbollah is entirely armed and trained by Iran. Now I know that this is what the Americans say, and I know that a lot of people say, well, it's not entirely true, but they are entirely trained by Iran. On this point, the Americans are correct. When the clock stops, twice a day it's right. You know that adage. If a clock stops at 12 o'clock, it's right at 12 o'clock and at midnight. The rest of the day it's wrong. So on this point, the Americans are quite right that Iran totally trained Hezbollah, but had a hard time getting logistical material to Hezbollah because Saudis and the Egyptians would not allow Iranian ships through the Suez Canal. So that means by sea they could not resupply Hezbollah, and it was impossible to fly Iranian planes into Beirut airport because for a long time Beirut was either held by the Israelis or there was an American marine presence in Lebanon. So the Iranians began to fly logistical supplies to Damascus airport, which is only about an hour away from the Lebanese border, and then the arms and things would go into things. So the link between Syria and Iran goes back to the 1980s. Very close link. Again, it is useful for shallow-minded people to say, well, Iran is a Shia country and Syria is ruled by a Shia government, in other words, Alawi, and that's what links them. This is nonsense. Iran's link to Syria has nothing to do with Shiism and Alawiism, because for a long time, the sheikhs in Najaf, in the heart of thinking about Orthodox Shiism, and in Qom, Najaf is in Iraq, Qom in Iran, for a long time they thought of Alawis as heretics, not as Shia. In the same way as, say, for instance, people think of the Ahmadis in Pakistan as heretics. So it's not a religious connection, it was a geopolitical connection. They needed. So that tie was very close, and it strengthened from the 1980s onward. Now, the Americans have been trying to break this tie ever since they wanted to subordinate Iran. So for the last 20-some years, the Americans have believed that the link between Syria and Iran must be broken. For years, the United States and Saudi Arabia inside Syria have tried to produce sectarian divides. Now this was entirely revealed to us. I saw this on the ground in the growth of Saudi mosques in Aleppo, Saudi sheikhs in the countryside of the north, in the great Syrian desert. But that's only one piece of it. That could have been accidental. A WikiLeaks cable, and in fact several cables, showed how the Americans were working with the Saudis to promote grievances of the Sunni population against the Alawis, and saying that the Alawis are related too closely linked to Iran. This has been a long-term project to break the link between Syria and Iran, not to weaken Iran or Syria, but to weaken Hezbollah. Because Hezbollah has been a real threat to Israel. And Israel is a province of the United States. So that was the reason why Syria had to be broken. That was their project. Now, when the Arab Spring starts, it was genuinely from the Algerian uprisings in the 1990s outward to 2011, 10 and 11, there were lots of grievances of different kinds of people, certainly. I mean, which country doesn't have grievances? Have there been protests in India? Surely, lots of grievances. Many of these people came on the street, and like in most of these one-state countries, because there's no space for political amplification of your voice, the There's no accordion effect. When there's no protest, the accordion is closed, the protest start opens. Other people will appear to absorb the protest. There's no way to bring the conversation forward, no open media, nothing. They shot people in the town of Dara in the south, killed some children and so on. That happened, it of course happened. Moment Syria opened, the Turkish government, I don't have time to get into Turkey's involvement in this, Turkish government opened its border. And all these fellows came in that I met. Algerians, Libyans, basically fellows who had been part of Al-Qaeda groups in North Africa, trained by returnees from the Afghanistan war. So it's all a big full circle back to Saudi Arabia and the World Muslim League, founded in 1964, set up to amplify grievances on religious lines in the Soviet Union to bring the Soviet Union down. This is a project the Saudis had run since 1964 in collaboration with the CIA. It's a well-documented thing. It's called the World Muslim League. They still meet. It's an annual meeting. It looks like a little bit like it's now, you know, I don't know, not NATO meeting, but you know, the G20. They sit at a big table, but actually underneath that, the thing is spread these fellas all over the world, create chaos. That's the Saudi game. Remember, the Americans say force of stability. So all these fellows came through Turkey. I don't have, we can talk about this later. I want to quickly move on to the next thing. What 15 minutes more? 20 minutes, yeah? All these fellows came in, and suddenly what could have been the opening of a new democratic discussion inside Syria, which is long overdue and had begun with the Damascus Spring of 2001, 10 years before this civil war. These fellows come in armed to the teeth, many of them armed by a project the CIA ran, bringing arms from Eastern Europe to arm them. So you saw all of them with Eastern European weapons, came in there and just destroyed that country. Now I can't tell you what a shame it is that Aleppo in Syria. Damascus is the second largest, it used to be second largest. Now of course Aleppo, such a great city. You know, after the Turkish genocide against the Armenians, large numbers of Armenians moved to Aleppo. It's a rich, complicated city, destroyed by this. What was it destroyed by? Almost 1 million Syrians had to flee the last 5-6 years drought in northern Syria, the great Syrian plains. And they came into cities like Aleppo, where charity was provided by Saudi mosques. And each of these Al-Qaeda units that I encountered had a sheikh with them, not the emir, the fighting emir, but a sheikh, a religious instructor, who was either Saudi or trained in Saudi Arabia. I mean, it was like a battlefield replica of Afghanistan circa 1980. Total battlefield replica. Now, what's interesting is the Western media, it was stunning. I'm just going to tell you the little detail I'm going to pivot. No Western reporter was able to go to so-called rebel areas and report without getting killed. So my friends, 2 of them were beheaded by ISIS. One of them, the first person beheaded, very decent person, went in through the Azaz crossing, was captured by the Free Syrian Army and sold to ISIS, and he was the first person beheaded on television. He was a young man, wrote poetry, very nice, sensitive person, but he was no reporter went into the so-called rebel area, so-called democratic freedom fighters, so on, and came out alive, except a few who went in secretly. You see, here's the interesting thing. I'm a reporter, I go into a so-called rebel area, which is supposed to be bringing democracy, and I announce myself as a journalist, I should not be killed. You're supposed to be bringing democracy. Meanwhile, you could drive into Damascus and then the same reporter would complain about being shadowed by a security person. In other words, if you go to the other side, you'll be killed. But if you go into the government side, you'll be shadowed by an intelligence person, and that you found inconvenient. Now, I found this incredible in the reporting. They would say, you know, we are in the Damascus, but we are only being shown things that the government wants us to see. But you can't see anything on the other side, you'll be killed. And yet you are coming out and writing things pro them. I want you to think about this seriously. Like, okay, you know, you want to make a revolution, you want to create some sort of, you know, Saudi country inside thing, you want to kill all the Alawites, you want to kill all the heterodox kind of traditions in Syria, that's up to you. But if you're a journalist, I think some measure of judgment needs to be there. In other words, if you can't go there and report from there and make it out alive, we should hear what the condition is there. This is what happened as the war proceeded. Early on in 2011-12, it was possible to go there because these chaps hadn't dominated the whole civil conflict. First 18 months or so, it was okay. You could go to Aleppo and so on and meet some of the young people who were protesting, you know, people that are familiar to you, so-called anti-nationals, you know, that are protesting, familiar. But suddenly these anti-nationals were shoved aside and these real characters arrived. Now, you got to understand that, you know, young law students and so on that are protesting, they don't know how to make an armed battalion. For that, you need veterans from Algeria, Libya, and so on. And these guys don't have any politics. For politics, they turn to their sheikh. What's next, friend? They don't have any vision. They're just there to play guns. And I wrote about them and I said they look like Jesus with guns. You know, long beards, straggly hair, and big, big guns. They don't care about anything. They're shooting anybody. Brutal, vicious fighting. So now the country is destroyed. Who pays the price for that destruction? Let's move on to Libya. Okay, I'm going to spend some time in Libya and then I thought maybe Egypt will be the last thing. Libya is an incredibly bizarre country because, friends, it's like having a country in the middle of a desert where there's no countryside, meaning it's a bunch of little cities that are attached to each other by roads. There's very little countryside, except in the very north. Until the Libyans discovered oil, their big export was a kind of grass that is used to make paper. I mean, number two export from Saudi Arabia, except for finance and so on. Number two, solid export, you know, tangible export is dates after oil. I mean, of course they export capital and so on. I'm saying put all that aside. After oil, it's dates. So in Libya, before oil, it was this grass, Asparta grass, or whatever, that makes paper. Libya was a strange place because I first went there in 1974, and I got to tell you, when the Libyan government came in '69, when Gaddafi came, there was no resistance. Why? Because the previous fellows were horrible. They were horrible. This Idris, you know, the government of the kings before. Gaddafi was a greatly loved guy, and I've got to say, incredibly charismatic, wonderful looking, huge pictures of him everywhere. Everybody was happy at that time. But of course, you know, why would you expect a military colonel by himself, now in charge with everything, to know how to run a government? You know, this is one of the problems in some of these countries where you get a revolution by the gun, and then they are supposed to know how to shape a government and make a democratic polity. I mean, if you read Gaddafi's Green Book, for instance, it's a little embarrassing. There's a hodgepodge idea, some Marxism, some Quran, some this, some that. Nothing systematic. You ask a Libyan, you know, what's your oil policy? Well, you know, we sell the oil and we get the money and we turn it over to the people. You know, but what are you doing for 20 years? Are you building a sovereign fund? Are you creating, diversifying your... Still, number two is grass. So, there were lots of holes in the Libyan project. And of course, with liberalization, when Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, who might now run for president, came back from London, where he took a PhD at the London School of Economics, I think. When he came back, he wanted to liberalize the country. He used to openly say, I want to make Kuwait on the Mediterranean. I don't know why he didn't say Dubai on the Mediterranean. I mean, if you're going to choose between Kuwait and Dubai, I would go with Dubai. You know, okay, malls and so on, better than Kuwait. By the way, there are 500,000 Keralites in Kuwait. I don't even know that. It's one of the most dense population of Malayalis out. I think not even with India, because it's a very small locality where they live. 500,000 So he would say, we want to make Kuwait on the Mediterranean, you know, and they started liberalizing. Of course, disgruntlement comes. And the other thing, and this is very common to left governments globally, is Gaddafi, by dint of God knows what, created a whole bunch of higher education institutions and did it cleverly. He put the law school in Benghazi, he put this agricultural college in Sabah, you know, he distributed education, so everything was in Tripoli. It's a very good idea, you know, to decentralize the major educational institutions. Now the thing is that you create lawyers in a structure where it's not clear what the role of the lawyer is. It's rather idiosyncratic state project. So there are all these disgruntled lawyers in Benghazi. I knew many of them, lovely people, committed to social justice. So in Libya, when the cracks began to show in this Arab Spring, many of these lovely lawyers, including my friend Salwa Bulgagis, who was later killed terribly, shot outside her house by one of these Al-Qaeda types, these people came out and said, you know, we want Arab Spring in Libya. Now, you know, imagine in Delhi, if 20 lawyers go to Rashtrapati Bhavan and say, bring down the regime. You know, or not Delhi actually, not Delhi. Let's say in Calcutta. They go and say, bring down the Modi government. We call upon the NATO to bomb, you know, what is it called now? Kalyan something road? Used to be Racecourse Road? Lok Kalyan, sorry, Lok Kalyan Marg. Right? Bomb it and, you know, can you imagine what would happen to these 20 lawyers? What do you think would happen? Huh? What would Mamata Banerjee's government in Bengal do to these 10 lawyers? Huh? Cities, they'd be arrested, thrown in a dungeon somewhere, right? They'd probably be made to eat the penal code. Brutal people, right? So, I mean, it's not like a government is very kind to people who say we call for the downfall of the government. But interestingly, very quickly the military in Benghazi defected to this rebellion. Very quickly. And then the media takes over. And this is why I want to say as a reporter, I'm embarrassed about how the media created the Libya war. Created it. It's a manufactured war. How is it a manufactured war? I mean, I remember being in the United Nations during the first vote in the Security Council around UN Resolution 1970. There were two votes, 1970 and then 1973. The UN Secretary General, then Ban Ki-moon, his secretariat started to say, we have reports that genocidal activity is going on in eastern Libya, that is towards the town of Ashtabia, on the road to Benghazi. I mean, I remember taking that secretariat member aside and saying, listen, I'm going to ask you a question when we come back. The question is going to be, what is the basis of your understanding that genocidal activity is happening? He said, oh, don't ask that question. You know. So we went back and I asked, what is the basis of your statement that genocidal activity is happening on the Ashtabia road on the way to Benghazi? And he said, press reports. Now, if you're clever, the question to ask is, which press? Correct? Press reports is too vague. So I asked him, because I pretend to be clever, which press? There was a lot of shuffling and so on, and then he said, Al Arabiya. Now, if you know anything about the Arabic language media, you would know that Al Arabiya is not a newspaper. Al Arabiya is a press release. Is a press release that comes out of the Saudi royal family, that masquerades as a newspaper. In other words, it's a newspaper in name that is essentially direct propaganda from the Saudi royal family. So the United Nations Secretariat was willing to endorse Saudi Arabia. Now, a few years before then, I don't know how long I'm going on for, but just a little longer, I'll finish the story. A few years before this thing began, at an Arab League meeting, Muammar al-Gaddafi, who is nothing if not slightly unhinged sometimes, turned to the king of Saudi Arabia and said to him, "You are a creation of the British." In the middle of the Arab League meeting. "You are a creation of the British." And then worse, he turned to the Emir of Qatar and said, "You are a dog of the Americans." Now, guys, you are studying international something or the other. And you are studying all kinds of models and so on, correct? You know, I don't know what their names are, but I bet they're very serious and important political scientists. I bet 99% of them are Americans. Maybe, most likely. The whole field is dominated like that. The problem is you'll never understand a monarchy if you try to use rational choice theory, XYZ theory. No, you'll never, because they are monarchies, guys. They are absolute monarchs. And they hated Gaddafi. That's just a fact. I mean, he called the Emir of Qatar, not the current Emir, but his dad, he called him a dog of the Americans. He used the word dog. Now, I remember lots of, you know, that curious CNN type coverage that says, well, in Islam, a dog is a this, a that. You know how they do this sort of cultural analysis. In Islam, a dog is, you say that, it's a great affair. You know, by the way, you don't need to be a Muslim to be offended, frankly. When somebody says you are a dog of the Americans, you don't have to have a whole Orientalist discussion about in Islam XYZ happens. He called a human being a dog of the Americans. He's the Emir of Qatar, one of the richest people in the world. And he says to the king of Saudi Arabia, "You are a creation of the British." I mean, the Saudis believe they unified Saudi Arabia. They didn't need Lawrence of Arabia. But Gaddafi is saying, "You're nothing. Look at me. I made it. I threw out the king. I resisted the Americans. They killed my child." All this stuff Gaddafi used to keep saying, go on forever. You know? So, they hated him and they wanted him out. This was a huge opportunity. Plus, this Gaddafi, again, mercurial crazy guy, had helped finance the presidential election of Nicolas Sarkozy. And he started to spill the beans. I don't know if you watched this stuff was not adequately reported. He started to say, "I paid for your election. You know, Gaddafi, you're the dog of this. I paid for you. You're in my pocket." I mean, in fact, the hilarious part was the speech he gave in Tripoli where he went to the Green Square during the uprising and he said, "I don't know what all this Kleenex is." He was talking about WikiLeaks. He kept saying, "Kleenex? I don't know Kleenex." He's a fascinating person. But he didn't, you know, he wasn't able to conduct genocide. Guess what? The whole battalion, or part of it, had defected in Benghazi. It was a very difficult war. If it had been easy, the Libyan troops would have been in Benghazi in an afternoon. You know, I have driven down that road in less time than that, unless there's a sandstorm, because it's a good road. It has to be a good road. Do you know why it has to be a good road, the road from Tripoli to Benghazi? Because all along the road are oil refineries. And forget human beings. Oil trucks must have good roads. Because that's the way the system, these are great roads, and yet they were trapped outside Ashtabia. Because there was fierce military resistance from Benghazi. You see, there was no genocide. Afterwards, human rights agencies looked at the death count and they found that there were mostly men killed. Now the general assumption is if they're mostly men killed, they're not bombing civilians. That's the general assumption. Now I don't know how accurate this is, but human rights agencies use this as a barometer to gauge genocide and so on. This is not, to my mind, the perfect barometer, but it was even evident from the ground. From Benghazi, it was clear that there were jets flying that were with the rebellion there. NATO, after UN Resolution 1973, and here India and all didn't play as good a role as they should have. Now Hardeep Singh Puri is the minister of something or the other in Delhi, right? He's, I don't know what his job is. He's Minister of State for Transportation, in charge of the Delhi Metro and so on. He was the Indian ambassador to the UN. I did a long interview with him for Frontline about the Indian role in the Libyan conflict and Syria. Now, these countries, India, Brazil, they were all in the UN Security Council when the vote came for UN Resolution 1973. And that resolution, India and all voted not for it. they voted against it. But that resolution had a phrase which says, any member state must take action to prevent, essentially genocide. Any member state. Guys, how many member states can go and bomb Libya today? India cannot. India doesn't have aircraft carriers sitting in the Mediterranean. India doesn't have bases in Egypt. When they say any member state, we should always insist that these circumlocutions should not be permitted in international law. That resolution should have said, the Europeans and the Americans have been given permission to destroy Libya. That should have actually been the text. Because this phrase is useless. I mean, you should really, as students of this stuff, look at this, specifically, like these so-called abstract, phrases, any member state, this is a lie. What that resolution 1973 said is that France and the United States can destroy Libya. And that's what they did. And they bombed it indiscriminately. Final thought on Libya. At the end of the war, many of us wanted to ask NATO to help us understand civilian casualties and the excessive bombing of Libya. Human Rights Watch sent a formal request to Peter Olson, who was the lawyer for NATO. And Peter Olson, I wrote about this in the Hindu, long piece on Peter Olson's reply to Human Rights Watch. Peter Olson, the lead lawyer for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, supposedly a civilized force. Brutal, barbaric, doing all kinds of terrible things in Afghanistan, etc. But they present themselves, said the following, and I really want you to think about this because this comes directly to the heart of the concept of imperialism. Peter Olson wrote in his letter that I hope when you study civilian casualties in Libya, you will not study NATO's bombing because NATO, prima facie, cannot conduct human rights violations. In other words, look at Syria. Barbarians kill barbarically. Civilized people don't really want to kill anybody, but we are forced to. They kill allopathically, we kill homeopathically. Small doses here and there. Precision bombing, for instance. We are homeopaths of war. These fellows are allopaths of war. They come in with. Now, it's incredible because I can tell you from seeing it from the ground, the United States and France carpet bombed parts of Libya. The Assad government, let's assume all the stuff about barrel bombs and so on is true, and some of it is certainly true. We're using helicopters and homemade bombs in parts of Syria. Now compare, these massive, sophisticated American and French planes, including, what's the plane Modi wants to buy?
Rafale.
Wow. Used in the Libyan war, so sophisticated, that plane. So expensive. If it's expensive, it must be good. So expensive. That's acceptable war. This is unacceptable killing. I just want you to think about this. Some of the barbarians are bad, obviously, because guess what? They're barbarians. And the civilized people are. That's exactly what Peter Olson's letter said. I'm not making it up. Meaning, I'm not making a joke about barbarians kill barbarians. This is exactly what he said. He said, I hope you understand that NATO cannot kill indiscriminately. Well, why can't it kill indiscriminately? Because it's civilized. And I want you to think about that. Finally, Egypt, very briefly, and then we can. Egypt is fascinating because it brings us back to our dear friend Rosa Luxemburg. Tahrir Square was truly a festival of politics. But there were nobody from agricultural Egypt. Rural Egypt was not represented in the uprising in 2011. This is very important. Egypt is predominantly a rural society in demographic, in terms of the ordinary people. There was almost no agricultural presence in this uprising. The uprising took place in Cairo, it took place in Alexandria on the Mediterranean, and in Port Said. But it wasn't in the small towns and hamlets in Upper Egypt. Now this is important for two reasons. It's important demographically, because you didn't have all the population rising up. Secondly, and most importantly, from a strategic point of view, the military is recruited from rural region. So the military had no loyalty to the uprising and was ready to crush it. In fact, body types, one interesting thing is military fellows in Egypt are darker skinned and shorter than urban Egyptians. So there's a physical thing as well. Why are they? Because it's a nutrition issue. It's not that, some racial thing necessarily. It's nutrition, it's history, it's whatever the hell it is. I'm not an expert in this, but I can tell you visually, in Egypt, the generals are all much taller and the soldiers are shorter. They come from rural Egypt. In the Russian Revolution, when the White Army tried to recruit people in the periphery of the new USSR, and they'd go into these rural areas and say, join us in overthrowing the tyrannical Bolshevik government. We have so many interesting memoirs written by white generals, meaning generals of the aristocracy, saying these bloody peasants wouldn't join us. They'd say, they have given us land, you want to come back as a landlord. At no point did the Egyptian revolution say any slogan for the countryside. They had no connection to the countryside. That's one thing I just want to put on the table. The second thing is it was disorganized. That was correct. There was no central unity. The main force in this uprising were professionals associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. Doctors, lawyers, homeopaths, that's the base of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's a professional class in the Arabic-speaking world and in Turkey. It's not the working class, it's small shopkeepers maybe, but it's the doctors, lawyers, school teachers. That's the group that is basically the mainstay of the Brotherhood. They were well organized. There were the liberals who have no base at all, none, zero. They are the ones who, of course, were blogging and so on, and who had the greatest noise in the internet world. And of course, when the internet was shut down, they had no base other than the media and so on, outside media. But they played an important role because they were sincere, decent people who came out there saying, we are against this government. Right? They played a very important role. I don't want to belittle their contribution, just practically they had no base. Third, and most importantly in any revolution, and we never pay any attention to them, were the street children. Because, you've got to understand something. In all revolutions, you see, the street children don't have to occupy the street. That's their home. And these fellows know how to fight the police. They spend their whole life fighting the police. So there were these streets that go out of Tahrir Square. It was these children who were out there fighting the cops, throwing stones, getting shot by this. There's one sniper who was used to. We. Who's the we? The we is an organized force that has a theory, that understands on the basis of the theory of some tactics. Based on the tactics, you have some ground level methods to go forward. For instance, seize the means of communication. It's a basic thing you do in they were just sitting in the square, waiting for the revolution to move forward. He says, we should. Should. See, should reflects an ethical question. You should have done it. Should based on what? Based on your theory of your revolution. If you don't have an organization with and you can have many organizations, if you don't have a place to create a theory of what you're doing, then there's no imperative to do anything particular. We should have done this. Who is the we and what do you mean by should? What external force is going to tell you what you should do? You should do something if you have a theory which compels you to do something. Now, for instance, if you are in a political organization and that organization has developed over time a theory, that theory provides some protocols of action and so on, what you might call a program. And so, based on the program, there is an ethical imperative to do certain things. Then you can say, you should do those things. You follow what I'm saying? Here it was anarchy in a way, and this brings me back to Rosa Luxemburg. Because in Reform and Revolution, Rosa Luxemburg talks about the importance of spontaneity, the necessity of spontaneity. You cannot assume that revolutions will be made or directed by a political organization. Because a political organization is not identical to the people. Spontaneity is when, for some historical reason, people start to get involved in things. They build the confidence to perhaps join a political demonstration called by an organization. Organization calls a demonstration. But many more people than that organization come spontaneously. They haven't been called out onto the street. They just come and join. That's the role of spontaneity. It's a very important thing because it shows that, there's a penumbra to the umbra of an organization. There's a whole shadow sections where people are doing things that are not directed by the organization. Spontaneity for Luxemburg is an essential concept in the Marxist understanding of political protest. But at the same time, Luxemburg makes the case for political organization. Because she suggests that if uprisings break out, and this is so perfect as a way to look at the Egyptian uprising. If an uprising breaks out, organizations need to come in and bring their full experience to bear to help spontaneous uprisings gain shape. Otherwise, they will be crushed. That's what reform and revolution comes to as a conclusion. Otherwise, they will be crushed. You've got to understand that from Morocco out to Iran, in fact out to Afghanistan, the left had been destroyed from the 1970s onwards. They've been killed, whether it's in the Emirates, the monarchy of Saudi Arabia. You may not even be able to fathom the fact that in the 1960s there was a Marxist uprising in Saudi Arabia. You may not be able to even fathom that today. That there was a member of the royal family who was a Marxist who led an uprising in Saudi Arabia. Can you imagine that even today as a possibility? It's crazy. You can't imagine that Iraq had the largest communist party in West Asia. And in 1958, when Qasem did his coup, he turned to the Iraqi Communist Party and said, help me, I don't know how to do things. I'm just a military guy. It might also surprise you that Sudan had the largest communist party in Africa, much larger than anywhere else. And they were destroyed. The left was destroyed in this whole region. So there was no experience of should. And I don't mean that communists are the only ones with the should, but all left organizations were essentially wiped out. Whatever the character of the government, or they were tethered. In Syria, for instance, the Syrian Communist Party is basically tethered to the government. It has no independent mode of operation. So why that's important, and I'm ending now, why that's important is that when somebody says they should do something, that should is absent. Which is why when one looks at this part of the world, it's a long-term process for people to take control over their lives. They have been literally victims of imperialism from maybe 60 years, for 60 years. When the possibilities of an alternative have been taken away from them. And the only platform available to them is the platform of either softly piety or hardcore Al-Qaeda type thinking. That's the only platform available, which is why these have been quite important. By piety, I mean movements like Tablighi Jamaat and so on, which don't have a huge role in that area, but piety movements of this part of the world. Especially in Egypt, there's lots of piety movements which say, remove yourself from politics, get more absorbed in your own personal piety. It's either piety, the moral, or it's Al-Qaeda. Because everything else seems to be suffocated. And that's the real tragedy of this part of the world. And I hope as you study things, as you look at things in this region, you don't get impatient with the people of this region or develop stereotypical understandings, of this or that position, pro-Assad, against Assad. All of this is, in a sense, to my mind, quite facile. Look beneath these things. Find the people. Thanks.